Welcome to 30 Minutes of Faith. We're very happy to have Rabbi Seth Castleman with us today, who has become a friend and a confidant and just another brother in the whole spiritual approach that we take. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you, John. Really nice to be here with you.
It's a pleasure for me. Now, let's start, as we usually do, by finding out where you started in life. Where'd you grow up, and parents and siblings and high school and those kind of things.
So I grew up in the suburban Boston area, Massachusetts. The youngest of three siblings and two parents. Grew up going to a Reform synagogue, but on the more conservative religiously side of things, with Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who's published a number of books and became a lifelong mentor and teacher of mine.
Did it cause you to think a little more conservatively in the Reform?
Well, in the sense of, my mom came from, and this is conservative with a capital C, meaning following more Jewish law. So we kept kosher at home. We were a bit more observant, I guess would be the way to put it, than many in the Reform movement. My father came from a much more social justice, politically active, but Reform/secular Jewish family, and so it was a nice blend between my mother's Midwestern roots and my father's Boston roots, and grew up with a fair amount of Judaism and a lot of family and a lot of social justice and politics in my childhood. There's a photo of me at a nuclear disarmament protest in a stroller with a banner, strapped to the back of the stroller, and I think Pete Seeger was performing. Yes, I think Pete Seeger. I think I saw probably 4 Pete Seeger performances by the time I was 4 years old at different events, yeah.
When I was growing up, I sang in a folk music group. There were 4 of us. We got started like freshmen in high school. And, we copied the Brothers Four and the Keekson Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary and all those guys. And we thought we were pretty good. We sang at other high schools and, summer fairs and all those other things. And, we thought we were pretty good. And then by the time you really reach adulthood and get to going, you realize that, oh, yeah, well, you know how to strum a guitar a little bit. And if you practice long enough, you can sing in harmony. So all of this unfolded, and during college and a bunch of other things we sang, and as we got older, people would invite us back to high school reunions and stuff. And so we just did a little bit of this for 50 years. And about 3 or 4 years ago, at one of the things in Salt Lake City, there was Pete Seeger, elderly.
Yeah.
But the man could play. And so, we just kind of stood there in awe, and then the leader of our group, the guy who actually got it started, whose father was the music teacher, invited him to come to the house. We'd all go up, and he just said, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
And we sat in the living room. And then I left, others left. 1 or 2 may not have even gone. But anyway, then Mark took a whole bunch of pictures and made some little recordings and various things with just he and Pete. And he thought, if I just die now, I'll go straight to heaven. Life is good, sort of thing.
Sure.
How about, what did your dad do for a living? What was he doing while you were growing up and all of this?
So my dad, for work, started out as a computer programmer in the mid-'60s, back when computers were the size of a building, but pretty quickly moved into personnel and management, and was very much of a people person, and so became eventually the president of a computer company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, although spent most of his focus and a lot of his time doing nuclear freeze work, test ban treaty and other such things, locally, nationally, and eventually internationally.
Did you grow up thinking your parents were good parents and that you were a lucky kid to be born to them?
Well, I think we all have. That's an interesting question. I think I had wonderful parents. I have wonderful parents. They're both still alive. I think they raised us very well. I think I realized how special some of the aspects, both in terms of faith and intellectual pursuits and politics. And my father was reading me the Greek myths when I was 3 or 4 years old, and So I think I was very blessed, but not to say that we as children necessarily realize how blessed we are.
Well, I asked that because not too long ago a guy said to me he thought the hardest thing that ever happened to him growing up was to find out how imperfect his parents were.
Sure.
And I got to thinking about it, and when you're little, you just think your parents can walk on water, and here you go, and all is well. And as you get a little older and start to think for yourself, you might have some disagreements.
Mark Twain had a wonderful line about it was remarkable how much my parents matured between when I was 17 and 21. Yeah.
Happened to all of us,
exactly,
I guess, right?
Exactly.
So, did you decide as a boy you wanted to be a rabbi?
Not at all. When I was maybe 14 or so, I was given, actually I think as a Hanukkah gift, a wonderful new translation of the Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, translated by Stephen Mitchell, and sort of found my calling in Eastern spirituality. Before that, at my bar mitzvah at 13, Rabbi Kushner gave me, as was the tradition, the 5 books of Moses, what we would call the Torah, but in English and in Hebrew with the commentary below in book form. He made the mistake of giving it to me, and I made the mistake of reading it. And what I saw in there was a king, male, patriarchal figure on high that was distant, a lot of misogyny, slavery, racism, wars for the sake of financial gain. Not to mention also I had become vegetarian many years before that already, and there was slaughtering of animals not just for eating them, but somehow that God wanted to smell the burning flesh. So I sort of threw it all out, so to speak. I tried to say that I wasn't Jewish anymore, and people said, well, no, you still are, whether you like it or not. So I started saying I was Jewish on my parents' side. I then found the Eastern spirituality, which eventually in my early 20s led to the Buddhist Dharma and the Vipassana meditation world, and it was a circuitous route to come back to Judaism in my 20s.
Not too long ago, a new Buddhist meditation center was opened down in Rancho Cordova, and they asked me if I'd come down and give a blessing on the facility. That was a sweet experience. That was a really, really sweet experience. Took our shoes off, everybody went in, and they had a man or two woman speak, and then, all those other things, and then they wanted this quiet, silent meditation time before the prayer, and it was, the dews of heaven really settled nicely on that, and I really enjoyed that. And Sister Hansa, who's Brahma Kumaris here in town, I try to go down there every month or two, and it's just all about quiet and goodness and gentleness, and I really, really do like that. So where did you go to college?
At Marlborough College in Marlborough, Vermont, and then...
Why? Was there a specific reason to go there?
Teenage years were a struggle for me. Wanted to break out and do something somewhat alternative.
Understand the concept.
That was an alternative path to go, and then from there drove and hitchhiked and jumped freight trains across the country and found myself out to California.
And how was that? Were you always safe, and did it go pretty well for you? And
I think my mother would say I wasn't always safe, and she would also say I didn't tell her the most scary stories till many years later. But I think it was one of the best things I did, certainly till that point in my life, and that I was seeking both a spiritual meditation community and teacher, and also, even by that point, I was doing social service work with developmentally disabled, autistic adults and kids who had suffered and survived severe sexual violence and abuse, and was looking for some alternative communities and approaches to working with people with real trauma and suffering. So that was kind of my journey of seeking both a spiritual community for myself and an intersection of serving people in need and sort of remembering that we all have a deeper longing beyond our physical needs and our worldly needs.
Did you do that just naturally? I'd like to try that. I think that would be a good thing to do. Or did somebody say, hey, you should be over here doing this?
I think I grew up in an internal world and an external world that really fostered that in beautiful ways.
That's good.
I was actually originally looking into spending a year in sort of more of a Thoreauian experience in a cabin in New Hampshire, and It was a somewhat older, compared to me, he was maybe late 20s at the college, who encouraged me. He said, you know, if you put yourself in a cabin for a year, you're basically stuck with all your thoughts and all your mishigas, as we would say in Yiddish, all your craziness, and you're just sort of stewing in it. You might do better traveling, where you have the opportunity to try things out and remake yourself and have new experiences. And so I did that, and then years later I sat in the cave or the cabin when I started doing contemplative practice.
Some years ago, we were in Mont Saint-Michel in France, and we'd gone up to the very top to check some things out, and my wife and a couple other women said, well, we'll go down this way, and I said, okay, I'm going to go this way. And the man down in the street down below it earlier said to us, you can take any route down, they all come down. Mm-hmm. So, you know, okay, you know, and they had, you know, some areas over there I wanted to look at. Well, anyway, before long, I was in the bowels of that cathedral, and I had no idea where I was. And a Trappist monk came by, you know, and he was all hooded and covered up, and I said, hey, how you doing? You know, I'm a little lost here. And he didn't even break stride. He just kept right on going, you know. And I had that feeling, you know, I know I'm not really lost, but I'm lost here.
Sure, yeah.
And you know, I had to stop and pray, and you know, I kind of began to absorb the feeling of the great cathedral there. And then it was like, well, you know, why don't you try that one over to the left? And pretty soon it came right down, and you know, there we were. So there's good to be alone sometimes, and there's really good to be where there's other people to help and pursue.
I would completely agree, John. I would say it's good to be alone. I would say it's also good to be lost, and that in our society today, whether it's about keeping on track with your work, or from school to work, or to marriage, or whatever it might be, that we often forget all the benefits of being in the don't know mind and being lost. And what is one of my teachers called it, the pretense of accident. You think it happened as an accident, but it's only when you allow yourself to step into the place of being lost that there's room for wonderful things to come in, and that boredom is a great lost art in our society today, when we can distract ourselves with our phones and our computers and our televisions and our conversations, that a lot happens on the other side of boredom. The other thing I really appreciated that story and the idea that sort of all paths lead. And I would agree with that there are many different ways to find whether you're looking for God or enlightenment or truth, or a way to serve the world, or I also think I've come to think that the metaphor of sort of one spiritual mountain and many paths up to it is a bit of an oversimplification and doesn't quite respect the differences in the different faith traditions. And I've come to see that perhaps a better metaphor would be a mountain range, and that they all lead up, but the mountains are distinct, and that at the top, the mystics standing at the top have very similar experiences and say similarly little about it, but they have the view, they have the altitude. Interestingly, they can't see their own mountain so well, but they can see the world around. When you're at the base, where most of us are for most of our lives, you mostly just see your mountain. And if the base of your mountain is in the tundra, and the base of somebody else's mountain of their tradition is in the desert, fundamentalism is when we say, well, you're wearing sandals and a t-shirt, you're clearly not on the one true mountain. Mine is the true mountain, yours is not. But when we get up, it comes more together. Having said that, there really are strengths and differences between the traditions. I would say Buddhism has a real understanding of the nature of mind and contemplative practice in ways that I don't think the Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Abrahamic traditions have developed.
I agree with you. I flew once from Wuhan, China, which is a city of about 5 million, kind of in the middle of China, to Lhasa, Tibet. And the airport is at 14,000 feet. And you fly over the Himalayas, and you know, as you're going along. Well, you look down, and there are these huge, huge glaciers and valleys of just ice that are as big as, you know, a small state, and you know, all these other things. And you're just kind of, whoa, look what the top of a mountain really is compared to, you know, going up the foothills somewhere.
Sure.
When we got in Lhasa and spent some time there, I came across a guy who wanted to tell me about a Shangrila that had been found in the Himalayas. I said to him, well, describe Shangrila. He said, oh, green and rivers and waterfalls and jungles and ferns and all the things, you'd think it. And I said, in the Himalayas? He said, yeah, it exists. My grandfather's been there, or my great-grandfather's, I think. Anyway, for months after that, I thought about what I'd seen of just the harsh, cold, bitter ice, everything. You could see the wind, down there. And I don't, those mountains are at 25,000 feet, and we're probably flying at 35,000 or something. And then I got to thinking about the Shangrila, and that's kind of, everybody, well, it'd be fun to live in Shangrila. Life is just easy, laid back. And that was, that kept me busy in my inner self for several months, thinking about all of that. And he hadn't been there, but he had all of the stories of his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and he believed him. And, Grandpa wouldn't lie to me, he believed all that stuff.
Sure.
Anyway, your analogy of the mountain range is really, really good, because there's a gazillion things unfolding on the mountain range and then in the foothills and everything leading there.
Yeah.
So well said.
I would say that Shangrila is not, to me, is very reminiscent of, in your tradition and mine in the Judeo-Christian, of the Garden of Eden. And, on one level, we are mystically and as a world trying to get back there. And to think that there is the possibility of, whether you call it heaven on earth, whether you call it world peace, whether you call it a taste of warm weather and sun and rivers up at 20,000 feet, whether it's there or not, I think is less the point. The question is, are we using it as our North Star and as our aspiration?
I couldn't agree more. How long will you be a rabbi? Do you die a rabbi when you're 88?
It would be a blessing to live to be 88. It would be a blessing for me to live the rest of my life as a rabbi. The ordination process is for life, unlike when I did a temporary ordination as a Buddhist monk, where I knew I was doing it just for a set period of time. But also the role, as you know, the word rabbi means teacher. The community called Jesus rabbi, as my teacher, quite literally. And it can take different forms. Right now I'm not serving a congregation, and actually when I first became a rabbi or was on the long journey to become a rabbi, I didn't see congregational work as primary or necessarily what my role would be. I wake up many mornings wondering, why did I become a rabbi, or what does being a rabbi mean to me today? But that's also part of the Jewish tradition too, to continually question and engage with. An Israelite is a God wrestler, as Jacob was, one who wrestles with God, which means not just getting along and holding hands and frolicking through life with God. It means engaging and wrestling and struggling and doubting.
One time some years ago, a man said to me, do you believe in Christ from a Christian's point of view? I said, I do. And then he said, do you believe Christ? And that set a lot of wheels going. And when I think about other religions, I walk into a synagogue. A couple of years ago, Dallin Oaks, who is a former Utah Supreme Court justice and a leader in the Mormon faith, spoke at B'nai Israel. And several of the Jewish leaders sat behind him, and the synagogue sanctuary was filled. It was a wonderful meeting. It was a wonderful meeting, and he talked a little bit about the Jewish faith, and he talked a little bit about the Christian faith, but he talked about people, the brother and sisterhood of it all, and he talked about the things that we sometimes battle at school or work or play or in our homes, And the reason I can tell when it's been a good meeting is when it ended, nobody wants to leave. And that's the way that was that day. It came to an end, they thanked everybody, and we're going to serve some refreshments. Everybody just kind of stood around. Nobody wanted to leave the sanctuary. It was really a cool thing.
B'nai Israel and Rabbi Mona Elfi does so many wonderful things in the Jewish community and beyond in that regard, around social justice, around interfaith dialogue, around bringing great leaders into our community.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but right now you're the leader of the Rabbi Council, or is that what it's called?
It's a rotating, we have a board of rabbis here in Sacramento, and we have a rotating presidency. I think I wasn't there at the meeting when everybody else had nodded, or as the newest one in the community, it was sort of like, it's your turn.
Seth's not here, let's get
Exactly. So, but we have a very collegial group of rabbis of all different stripes within the spectrum of Judaism. So it's a blessing.
Now, with his tongue planted in his cheek, and I knew that, and just being of good spirit, a rabbi friend of mine told me long years ago, if you put 12 rabbis in a room, no two of them would agree.
I don't agree with that, Rabbi.
Good answer. I thought it was kind of fun because I thought to myself, oh, they're thinking for themselves.
Sure, yes.
You know, they're thinking,
yes.
And they're thinking about the congregation they serve, or where they're teaching or directing or whatever they're doing. You know, and I laughed and said, well, that seems pretty good to me. I kind of like that. Let's not just all say, okay, well, yeah, if you say go to the right, let's all go to the right.
It is very central to Judaism. When I said Buddhism has a real depth in its understanding of the nature of mind and contemplative practice, Judaism has very little dogma, if any, and whatever there is in terms of dogma, no three rabbis are going to agree on what that dogma is, and even if they did, their congregants or the community isn't necessarily going to follow it. We don't have a hierarchy of a pope, and that part of the seeking of truth and meaning is about the debate and the questioning. So the classic study of texts, where the two of us would be sitting across from each other studying the Talmud, the rabbinic texts from the collection of teachings from the time of Jesus to 400 or 500 years after Jesus, and we would be reading back and forth in Aramaic the discussions of the rabbis of then who were discussing what was in the Torah or the Bible, and then we would be discussing it and debating it. And one of my favorite Talmudic stories is about one of the great pillars of the Talmudic era. Was debating with his study partner, and his study partner, after 2 or 3 days of their discussion of some particular point, his study partner says, "You win, you're right," in Aramaic. And he says, "What do you mean, you're giving up so easily?" He says, "So easily, we've been debating it for 3 days." He says, "I'll tell you what, we'll switch. I'll take your position, you take mine, and we'll keep going." They went for another 3 days, and the same rabbi won in that direction as well. The point being, it wasn't about the minutiae, it wasn't about the little about that little point. It was about trying to explore and expand the mind, and it's almost like contemplating a Zen koan, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? Discussing something and questioning it from all sides to come to some greater, deeper truth.
If you sat down with your father to discuss some Mosaic teaching, would you agree most of the time as you talked?
On one level, very much so. On one level, we both, I would say he more than I, are contrarians and like to look at things from different sides. So it's not to say that we have some fundamental, we have fundamental differences, but it's more that I think actually he is someone that I engage in that way with, where we're trying to explore it and take different positions. But theologically and politically, I think we generally align.
I ask you that because my stepfather of many years, sometimes we'd talk about something and we'd go back and forth for 20 minutes, and then finally he'd say, particularly when I was a late teen, early adult, "We're not talking about this anymore." And then other times we'd go back and forth, and then he'd say, "You know what? I think you're right on that one." And the "don't talk anymore" meant I'm right and you're not changing me, and we're not talking about it anymore, sort of thing.
Yeah, sure.
So I talked earlier with your wife about your child and another one coming this fall. Does anything ever happen to us better than family and parenthood? And what's your take on? When you were a boy, did you sort of say to yourself, "When I grow up, I'm going to have children"? Do you think that crossed your mind?
I don't think I was one to make definitive plans. I don't think I had clarity in that regard, the way that some kids may have. Although I did tell my dad at age 4 that I wanted to be a philosopher, like the one that he was reading me stories about. And when he smiled and said, "Well, they don't really get a lot of appreciation," which he knew I already wanted the spotlight and the appreciation. I said, "Well, what about their books and such?" And he said, "Well, that's usually after they're dead that people read their books." And I thought about it and I said, "Well, then I'll be a dead philosopher." I think I probably always did think that I would have kids, although the contemplative monastic life has always been an aspect of the life that I've led and the life that I have thought about leading. But no, I have no greater blessing than the marriage and the family and our daughter Lila and another one to come. And
that's a pretty name, by the way, Lila. I've always thought that was a very pretty name.
It means night in Hebrew. as in day and night, and it's right there in the creation story. And Elizabeth and I wanted a biblical name, and Elizabeth also, I think, felt it was very empowering to name a girl to become a woman knight and sort of take back the power of the knight.
How long did you have to know Elizabeth before you started to think, oh, this could be my bride and the mother of my children and all those things? I mean, did that happen fairly quick, or?
I think in retrospect it happened very quick, and I know that because of how ambivalent I was and how much dancing I did in my ambivalence meant that I was seeing how serious it was. There was an added complication of she was studying to become a Christian minister, I was studying to become a rabbi. In her religious world, that was much more a possibility and acceptable. In my religious world, it was much less. It seemed like it was either the relationship or ordination, and which one was I going to give up? But as she said to you, we talked very soon. I think it was maybe on our second date that we talked about, well, if we were to have kids, how would we raise them in terms of religion? And of course, you make plans and you make commitments, and then life unfolds, and you keep working it out through the, God willing, decades of marriage.
You know, my wife and I started dating in 8th grade, and it took a while to fall in love, and all those other things. But I think we'd have gotten married when we were 16 or 17 if our parents would have let us, because we cared that much about each other. But I didn't see what the joy was going to be of being a father. I just did not see that, and part of that was I was too young. I knew I loved her. I knew she was really hubba hubba. I knew I wanted to be with her all the time and all of those things, but I didn't see that I would be holding a child one day and saying, I'm this child's father. Yeah. And I've got to try to do for this child what my father did for me, and what can I pull that off? And I just think being a father it's the crowning jewel all the way. Will you guys stay in Sacramento for a while, do you think? Or, I mean,
we live in Davis. We're very involved in the faith and political community in Davis and in Sacramento. We really like it here. I've learned not to make predictions about life, and certainly not to make commitments involving my wife without letting her speak first, second, and third. But yes, we are very settled here in the community.
Our oldest son asked me a couple of years ago, everything went along pretty good while we were growing up. What's the magic to that? And I said, all I had to do was back up your mother. That's all I had to do, and that worked out very nicely. Yeah. What about the Jewish? Every time we have a kind of a peace and a quiet and settlement for a little bit, then something else raises its ugly head toward the Jews. And we go through all of everything from swastikas to, whatever. Is that just going to keep on going, or just going to ebb and flow and ebb and flow? And
you're talking the world over?
Yes. I mean, why can't we just say, wait a minute, they've always been here. They're people we love. We know them. They're our friends and neighbors. Can't we just...
I don't have I have opinions and ideas that I think are right about a lot of things. I don't have a clear fix at the moment on sort of what the karma is of the Jewish people, or what all that is about, that history. I do know that there has been a lot of scapegoating and a lot of oppression and horribleness in the Jewish people's history, in the Israeli history, and in other people's history. I mean, you want to talk about the most successful genocide of all time? It was whites against the Native Americans here in North America, something like 98.5% successful. So scapegoating and oppression for many different reasons happens the world over. The why or the how with the Jewish community, I think there are a lot of different factors. I do think the world is healing and getting better in terms of society, and in terms of, there's on average the amount of people, or the percentage of people that are in poverty or are living in horrible situations, I think has decreased, and that things have gotten better. Does that mean there's no more anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or misogyny or racism or homophobia? Of course not. We need to keep working at it. And I think part of it also from the Jewish perspective, for me, it's less about why are people painting swastikas or why was there this oppression, but more, and we're coming up on Passover, is how do we use that? And with Passover and telling the story of the Exodus is about not only were they slaves in Egypt and then were free and found a journey to freedom, but me personally was a slave in Egypt, and tell it as a personal story. And how do we use that today to align ourselves and ally ourselves with people that are literally slaves, metaphorically slaves, otherwise oppressed, and that it's part of the Jewish karma to have this history, and how do we use it now to make the world a better place?
We're out of time.
It's been an
Thank
honor,
you
John.
very,
Thank
very
you.
much. It's nice to be with you every time.
Really a delight.
Okay.